How do you remember that all the time? And I don't. My golly. Every time, it's right here in front of me. I'd think of it probably in about 15 minutes. All right. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, this was the last, I'm just reviewing a little bit here. This was the last passage that we had looked at. And it's in Philippians 1, and it was verses 18 through 26. And of course, we remember, right, that Paul is in prison. He had talked about unity and holiness for the church. He was kind of pleading almost with the Philippian church to pursue unity and holiness. We talked about the challenge of the tension between those two. It's easy to be united if you just don't worry about how people act and behave. Holiness, if you're interested in holiness, holiness is fine as long as you just don't worry about unity and kick out anybody who doesn't behave as you like. But if you want unity and holiness, it becomes a challenge. And then last time we got into this passage where Paul is he's in this personal crisis, really, trying to wrestle back and forth with what's better for him. Is it better to just die now and go and be with Christ, or is it better to live? And, there's a lot of despair here as he's in this prison cell, not knowing what his future is going to be. It's not unusual that someone would be put in these holding cells and you would just stay there for years and years. They would just never make a decision on a sentence for you, and you just never knew where you were going next, and you just were there. Nobody ever gave you any information about your case. I mean, it could be very unpleasant. And so I think we saw Paul here as dealing with a little bit of despair. And he goes back and forth here. He says in verse 21 there, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. So if I live, then there's plenty for me to do. I'm going to be busy. There's a lot of fruitful labor that's there to be done. But which shall I choose?" he says. "I can't tell. I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and to be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary. On your account, Philippians, I know that I'll remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy." So for them and what he can do for that church, that to him would be fruitful work. But this passage also, I don't want to pass quickly over verse 23. We talked about that. My desire is to depart and be with Christ. This is one of those places in Scripture that makes clear to us what happens to the Christian once they die. We know that our resurrection, our resurrected bodies, the full resurrection for each of us comes when Jesus comes again at the second coming. So the question has always been, well, what goes on in the meantime? When someone dies today, where do we go? And this is one of the passages that we look to, because Paul has no question that if he were to die, be executed here in prison, that he is going to go on to be with Jesus. And so it's on passages like that that we base our hope and understanding when we think about what happens to someone when they die. Where are they now? Those whom we have loved and have lost in our lives, where are they now? They are with the Messiah. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know any more details than that, but that's all that really matters, is they're with the Messiah. And so when we say we know they're in a better place or they're a good place, it's not just a nice cliche. It's actually very, very true. So then he concludes and he talks about how whatever it is, whatever the result is for his life, it's all about God getting the glory anyway. And we talked a little bit about, how do we make sure that God's glory is really the most important thing in our life. And that was his focus. And for him, whether I live or die, as long as God gets the glory, he was fine with that. So that's kind of a little review of where we were. And so today I want to take a look at this next group of verses from 127 to chapter 2, verse 4. Melissa, would you like to read down through 127 to 130, the rest of chapter 1?
Sure. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and am not frightened in anything by your opponents. This, your unity, is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have.
All right, Terry, you want to finish up chapter 2 there, those 4 verses?
Okay. So if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort in love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by giving of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest.
Thanks, Terry. So Paul was really appealing here to them for unity. And this passage right here, going up to verse 4 in chapter 2, concludes what's considered to be the first of 3 parts of this letter. It's a 3-part letter, and the first part kind of ends here, and it's his last final plead for unity on their part. And it's unity knowing that they are in the face of a largely pagan world around them that surrounds this fledgling little community of Christians, this tiny Philippian church. There are people in that church of all kinds. We talked about that, of different races, locals, foreigners, Romans, non-Romans, Jews, Gentiles. They were all there, poor and rich. It was a very eclectic, mixed, diverse city. And here's this small group of Christians, and he's saying to them that they need to strive for unity. How the people of God are going to live within a pagan environment. And that's what he's speaking to. When a lot of us were younger and growing up, we lived in what was considered to be, it was a Christian environment. Maybe everybody around us wasn't necessarily Christian, especially if you lived in the cities. But what we called then the Judeo-Christian ethic, the basic understanding of the 10 Commandments, the basic understanding of morality based on Christian beliefs, Jewish beliefs, which overlap a great deal, that those were basically the understood beliefs of our culture. Whether anybody, whether they went to church or didn't belong to a church, we all kind of lived under that same set of values and understandings. That's very different today. So over the last 70 years, that has changed dramatically. Today, most of the Christians in the world don't live in the Western world. They don't live in Europe and North America. Most of the Christians of the world live in Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. And most of the Western world is no longer Christian. So most of Europe and North America are not Christian any longer. So it's a complete flip from where we were when you and I were kids, Terry, certainly. And it's much more now like it was when Paul was speaking to the Philippians. That the Christians were a group that was surrounded by pagans, secularists, Greek scholars, you name it, Greek philosophers, a lot of other thinking and ideas that were floating around in the culture at the time that was not Christian. And so, as Western Christians, American Christians, we kind of find ourselves in a place not so different from where the Philippian church was at that time. And so Paul is basically telling them to let your public life match with the gospel of Jesus. Let your public life look the same way. Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. What the gospel portrays, your manner of life should be in parallel with that. You should be living as the gospel suggests. And so that when people look at this small little community of Philippian Christians, they should be looking at you and not thinking, well, we certainly don't want to be like them. But they should see something that, even though at first they think your beliefs are strange, they don't understand what you're all about, they can't quite follow all of this, but they want to know more about this king that you're talking about. And that's what Paul found when he was in prison, right? Whenever he began talking to the guards. The guards at first, he was just another crazy who we threw in jail for whatever reason. But then they got curious. They became curious about what it was that these Christians were talking about and what it was that Paul believed that he would accept prison because of the strength of his belief. He would accept going to prison. Who was this king that he was so committed to? And he's saying that's the way outsiders ought to be looking at you. And he tells them that whether they get to see him again or not, because he doesn't know how this will turn out, he trusts that they're going to be standing firm in the Spirit, and that means being united and living out this new way that the gospel, post-Messiah, now the lifestyle that it puts forward for God's people, that they're going to do it. So this unity to him was absolutely paramount. In that 27th verse, with a single spirit, he's talking about struggling side by side with one another, that there's this united intent, that we are all together focused on the same thing. Remember way back when he talked about this partnership that we are in, that they were in together, that the Philippians and him were in a partnership for the gospel. And he's coming back to that. We're all in this partnership. We have a purpose, and we must keep our focus on this single purpose that we all share. And that unity, he said, would be a clear sign to them, to others, to those on the outside, of their destruction and your salvation, and that from God. So that when they see the life of the Philippian people, they will realize that the lifestyle that they have been living in, this pagan lifestyle, is destructive to humanity. It's not positive. It's not doing anything good for them, but that in fact, the gospel and the lifestyle that the gospel portrays actually is what they're looking for. That's where they find salvation. And it's in following God that they will find a new and much more positive life. So don't be afraid, he said. Don't be afraid about any of those things. Jumping down there to the the second chapter in verse 2. Bringing your thinking, he wants them to bring their thinking in line with one another. Hold on to the same love. Bring your innermost lives into harmony with one another. Fix your minds on the same things. It's this, pleading for you to be intentionally focused on staying together, because he understands the strains they're under. He understands that the strain that they live with the pagans on the outside, but the constant threat of division on the inside it's going to take you away. It's going to distract you. It's going to split you apart. So you're going to have to work hard, and you're going to need to focus on love to bring your lives in harmony with one another. This is just tremendously challenging stuff, isn't it? Let me just come back here with you guys for a second as I close this page. There we go. It's really challenging. I mean, think about any organization or a family. Even if people really like each other, even if people love each other as family, that kind of unity is really hard to come by. People see things differently. We have lots of different perspectives. We can look at the very same situation or event, and we could view it in very different ways. We like to do things our own way. People like to do things their way. And so the kind of thinking that he is suggesting to them and is saying is only possible to you because the Messiah has come, it's tremendously challenging. And he explains to them, though. He tries to tell them how to do that. So he's looking, you see, for a much deeper kind of unity. It's not the kind of unity where we just brush aside anything we disagree with, where we just keep our mouths shut and we don't argue about it for the sake of unity. It's not that kind of unity at all. It's where people can say what they need to say, that we can talk things through, and find a way to move forward together in unity, even though we come from very different places sometimes. The church has struggled with unity from way back then. It's just as challenging today, right? To find unity in the church. In the secular world on the outside, Paul has, he has a keen appreciation for how the outside world sees the church. How do the pagans see this small little church in Philippi? And it's the same way today. Outside the church, they take advantage of and love to see division in the church, because that makes the church look just like the rest of the world. The rest of the world can't agree on anything either. The rest of the world is completely divided everywhere you look. Well, look, the church is no different. Meanwhile, Christ has called us to a different kind of lifestyle. Well, the church has struggled to carry through and to rise to that standard for a long, long time, ever. Denominationalism creates that situation to an outsider, and they look at all the denominations in the Christian church, and they can't agree on anything. But when the churches can agree, when we can come together on some particular issue, when we can agree and the church can speak with one voice, then it becomes a very, very powerful voice, doesn't it? It rarely happens. It rarely happens. We see it when the churches can work together. You look at something like the Lighthouse. All the denominations, everybody supports the Lighthouse, some more than others, but everybody supports them. There's a common voice of the churches of this community that we need to reach out and help the poor and the hungry in our own communities. Common. Doesn't seem to be any dissension, no politicization about it. It's just something everybody commits to and does. And so the Lighthouse is a tremendously powerful force in the community because all the churches come together. And it just gives us, a glimpse of the power of God's people when we can come together. And exhibit the kind of unity that Paul's talking about. But boy, it's a tremendous challenge to do that. But yet that's the call. And Paul says in the midst of all that, you're going to be contested. Not only are you going to find it hard to be united on the inside, but there are going to be opponents out there. And he says, verse 28, don't be afraid of them. He's hoping you're not going to let those opponents intimidate you. Yes, there are going to be people that are going to try to stop you. They've tried to stop him. They're going to throw stones at you. They threw stones at him. They will undermine you in whatever ways they can, and they will try to convince you as a young church that you're mistaken. You have joined the wrong club. But it's not a club. It's a partnership with a purpose. Remember that Greek word way back at the beginning, koinonia, a fellowship, a partnership, and a fellowship that has a purpose. You're not just a club. You don't just get together because you like one another and it's an enjoyable thing to do. You are together because you have a purpose. And your purpose is to spread that gospel and to glorify the God of the universe. Let that be your strength, even when you feel the opponents trying to intimidate you. Don't let them. And he says, when you're not intimidated and you're united, that's actually a sign from God signifying that your former way of life, the pagan lifestyle you were all from, is going nowhere. It has no future. It's a lifestyle that destroys what it means to be human. It tears people apart. Wars, rumor of wars constantly, murder, chaos. That lifestyle has no future. And when you guys are united, it communicates that message. You guys are a sign that there's a different life to be had when you can stay united. And it also points to when God is going to ultimately set everything right, which is when he comes the second time. And when he comes, you, the Philippians, he says, will be seen to have been on the right path all along. When he comes, you will see that indeed we have been on the right path. The path we took and we followed is the right one. And now we know because we can see it. He went on to tell them that he's granted them to suffer. God has granted them to suffer for his sake. So not only is it going to be hard, not only is there opposition, unity will be hard, but you're going to suffer for his sake. So it's not a pretty picture. It's very real. He's not pulling any punches. This is what life is going to be like, but you have all this hope, and you're together, and you're united. It's hard for us, I think, in a culture where we have largely lived comfortable lifestyles, what it means to really suffer for the faith, to truly have to suffer for our faith. But for Paul, suffering was just kind of basic. It was like, this is what comes with the territory. If you're going to follow Jesus, you see what happened to him, you're going to suffer too for following him. And that's been true. That's certainly been true for 2,000 years. Jesus called it taking up your own cross. And it's the same idea, that we are going to suffer one way or another for our faith as we look around the world. Paul wants them to see that they are in the same struggle, and we see it as well. We are in the same struggle with people worldwide who are suffering, and some in very, very different ways. But as a church, we're in it together. We're brothers and sisters of those people. We share that. We're all in this same partnership, this same fellowship together for the gospel. And so when someone is suffering in another part of the world, we suffer too. So we share in that. He says there's always going to be struggle and persecution. That's never going to change. But it's the church's struggle. We're all in it together, and we're all suffering, but we all share in God's glory at the same time. And he says, Jesus said, anybody who's ashamed of my words, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed But he who confesses me in my life, that person is going to be welcomed, known, and vindicated. Jesus' words. So he's saying that whenever shame comes our way because of the faith, that we are to stay faithful. And those who are shamed for him will be welcomed and known. So hard stuff that Paul's getting into here. So what's the motivation? To him, the whole motivation for this is this shared life in Jesus and this comfort that comes with that. So regardless of all this opposition, the pain, the suffering, whatever it may be, the struggles inside, the struggles outside, he understands this partnership of faith to have comfort, that there's comfort within it. And I hope for those of us in the church that in a time of the suffering during this pandemic, that there was some comfort that we could all look to of being part of a church that was doing this together and reaching out to one another whenever one could. That's the kind of comfort that he sees that exists with this unity. That no matter what's going on, we're together. We can support and lift up one another. Paul says that if they stay in the Spirit, if they stay working toward unity, then he said that's where he will find his joy. That's where his joy will be made complete, whenever they stay together and of one mind. So how do you do that? How do we do that when day by day, very naturally, people don't agree on everything? They just don't. Let me just ask your response from what we're reading. What would be his answer to that? How do we maintain this unity whenever we know that everybody comes from different places, that we don't agree a lot of times on things? How do we maintain a unity in that? What would Paul say to that?
Well, for one thing, I think you have to think of how other people are feeling. Try to understand what they are feeling.
Yep, he would certainly say that people need to sit down together and listen to one another. Yep, and try to understand where each other come from. Try to work to a place that we can come together. Yep.
And I think, like, whenever you do have, like, a whole bunch of people, usually you come within, like, one thing where everybody does agree on.
Yep.
It's like, okay, so the sun is shining today. Yeah, we agree,
That's right. We can all agree on that, right? Find those places where we do all have common mind. Back in verse 2 of chapter 2, being of the same mind, having the same love. Certainly, Paul would say that has to be your foundation. You can't let anything undermine your love for God and for one another. And you can work out all these other things as long as your love remains intact. Let that always be your foundation. Yeah, then sit together, talk together, pray, seek God's Spirit. When he talks about in the Spirit, that's the other part of the partnership that he assumes, and we don't talk about nearly enough, is that it's a partnership between Paul and the Philippians and the Spirit of Jesus Christ. The Holy Spirit was released. The Holy Spirit is also one of the partners here. It's a partnership with us and with God, and his Spirit is his presence with us. And so we remember that the Holy Spirit and his wisdom, his discernment, he's also known as the Comforter. All those qualities that he brings are also part of what helps us to maintain this sense of unity among us as a church. verses, those last 2, 3, and 4, he gets real basic again. Don't act out of selfishness. It's kind of like, it's like what you're talking about, Terry. You know, there's some basic things. You've got to look at, like, what's my motivation for the way that I'm thinking about this situation? Is it selfish? Is it? He said, you know, he's always saying to submit. Always regard others as superior. You know, always be thinking about someone else and their need ahead of your own. So hard for people to do. Not trying to get one up on the next person, which is, you know, in most conversations, or even if it's an argument or it's a conflict and you can't agree, aren't you usually trying to get one up on the next person? While they're talking, I'm thinking about what I can say next to override what they're saying and to make an even better argument. All those things that are so natural for us as human beings, he's saying you want to rein all that in and turn them around. Remember, the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. And as his followers, we put others then ahead of us, which means we listen to them. We listen. We try to understand. He's saying that if you live this way, grasp this unity, live it out day to day, it'll be obvious to everyone else that there's something different about this group, and that will, in its way, preach the gospel. When people see it live in front of them, what is done for you and the way you all live, that's how the gospel will spread. So he's talking about public behavior. He's talking about what people see. In public behavior, I think it was interesting. I was just reading some of this about what was public and private in that culture. Almost everything was public. There was almost, unless you were wealthy, you had no real space to yourself. You had a very small home, and usually the doors were very, very thin, made of sticks tied together. That would be a door. Everybody heard everything that was going on in everybody else's house. There was very little in the way of what you would call privacy, especially when it comes to conversation. And a lot of conversation happened outside. It was a very warm climate. You were outside a great deal of the time. You got under a tree and people gathered and people talked. And so everybody kind of knew everything about everybody else. And so this lifestyle you're leading as Christians, everybody's going to see it. Everybody's going to know it. It's a really different kind of world from, where we are, where everybody, we go into our own homes and we've got space and it's quiet and we don't have to be heard by other people walking up the street. Totally different. Very, very public. Unless you were pretty wealthy. And one of the things that everybody knew was happening is what was not happening. And so they knew that these Christians, they knew how they would behave differently. And one of the major ways they would behave differently was that they didn't take part in any of the Roman festivals. There were regular Roman festivals to the various gods. They were usually parades, festivals, not so different than the kind of festivals we would have. 4th of July, that sort of thing. And major festivals on Caesar's birthday and the birthday of prior emperors. The Jews, those who followed Jesus, rather the Christians, those that followed Jesus, would not attend those. They didn't go to those. It was okay. Paul was okay if you want to just, if you go and party, but you're not going to go and worship the emperor. You're not going to worship any of their gods. So if there's worship involved in this festival, and there usually was, they weren't going. Everybody knew that. Joe and Mary, they don't go. They don't go to the other festivals that everyone else does. And there was always a concern about that, because if you didn't participate in those activities, it made it look like maybe you're then trying to undercut our culture, which is built around our gods and Caesar. And maybe whenever things don't go our way, whenever the gods don't seem to be looking favorably on us, there's a famine, there's been floods, it's usually the fault of those who failed to worship the gods and the emperor. And so one of the concerns they had to have was that they would appear to be the reason that when things went bad in a culture. In those days, it was always to turn to whose fault is this? Who wasn't worshiping the way they should? Who wasn't honoring our gods the way they needed to? And these Christians would be likely victims of that kind of accusation. But he's saying don't be intimidated by all this. And so the bottom line on all of it is you guys have got to learn to think in a really different way now. Messianic thinking, the thinking of what it's like to be after the Messiah came. Life is now, for you, totally different. It's not a beautiful, easy life, but it's a life that has the comfort that comes with being a community of faithful people. Before we close, let me just toss a question out here that we can just think about. This unity we're called to. What do you see as the barriers to unity in a church today?
Not listening to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very human nature, isn't it, for us to think what we think and not really want to hear or understand, or as the Indians would say, walk in somebody else's moccasins for a day, right? We tend to not really want to do that. We don't really have time for that. I'd rather just kind of tell you what I think and leave it at that. So that's definitely part of it.
I think we can have Paul come down and talk to our Congress about unity.
Yeah, I mean, right, exactly. I mean, it's such a mess there. I mean, there's no sense there of having a common mind, a common vision, a common appreciation for one another. It's just a crazy world down there. But even in a small church, I mean, it's unity is very, very hard. So, I mean, just think about all the things in a congregation our size that we differ on, right? So we have people who want to wear masks, people that don't want to wear masks, and that's become a major dividing line. People who want to come in and sing, people who think I don't want to be in a church right now where people were singing. I don't feel safe. We like different kinds of music. There are people who love hymnal music. There are people who love much more contemporary music. You name it, and that's not new. These kinds of divisions are in every church, and they've been there for forever. So how is a church supposed to build on unity? Where do we find unity when we have so many different opinions, preferences, likes and dislikes?
In the Word.
Yeah, we're all entitled to our opinion, but that doesn't mean that we need to make sure that everybody knows what that is.
Yeah.
And I mean, I certainly don't know what the answer is. You said about masks, and it made me think, the argument for or against masks ignores the science that there's a benefit to wearing them, and they do what they're supposed to, and that kind of thing. But for whatever reason, people are free to agree with that or not agree with that, but yet, it also maybe that sort of thing should kind of be treated the way we treat our belief in God and heaven. It's absolute. There's no argument that is Christians were going to go to heaven. But yet, some other stuff like mask wearing, I don't know, people are free to agree or not agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. But then how do you say, well, you're not, I don't know. You're not allowed to disagree with the science, but I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
Well, what did Paul say to them about how they would deal with trying to stay united? He basically said, your foundation still has to be love. We can accept and tolerate and live with a lot of differences if we let love be what guides us, right? In a family where people love one another, there's disagreements of all kinds. We don't like other people's behaviors. We don't like what they say. You name it. But love overrides all that, and we don't just throw people out and close the doors because we don't like the way they think or the things that they say. Love rules. And that's what Paul's saying unity has to be. And I think you made a good point, Melissa. We all have opinions, but what we like to do is to confuse opinions with truth. I like to think that my opinion is the real truth. The way I think is the right way. And for me, maybe that's the way I have to live, but I have to be really careful of thinking that my opinion is somehow absolute truth. It may not be absolute truth. You think, talking about masks, people have different levels of risk tolerance. For some people, going out without a mask, it's not that they don't believe it. They just think it's not going to happen to me. Other people are the opposite. They feel almost frozen in place to go out because I could get this. And it's not. They look at it and say, people are dying a very unpleasant death over this. Others are saying, no, most people get better without any problem. So it's how do you view risk, right? But if love is ruling, then I have to understand other people's perception and opinion is different than mine. And then mine isn't necessarily the truth. And I accept that. Paul, in a different book, remember, he talks about, when I'm with Jews, I behave as the Jews. When I'm with Gentiles, I'll behave as the Gentiles. Whoever he's with, I'll behave according to their customs as long as the gospel is proclaimed. So he was willing to go in, and if the Jews are not eating meats, he would not eat.
Lost, we're on.
We back?
You're back now.
I had lost you there for a minute too. There goes Terry. She's back. All right, I better bring this to a close. Somebody's telling me enough. But anyway, it's understanding that other people see things differently, and that my truth, the way I see it, it's not truth. It's just my opinion. And I tolerate that in another person because love rules that. So, whether I like wearing a mask or not, I'm going to wear it because
Gone again.
I care about other people.
Gone. You're gone again.
Am I back?
Well, at least I know it's not mine.
No, I think it's probably on my end because you guys are blinking in and out too.
Yeah, Terry's staying, so I don't think it's me.
All right, well, we'll close it there unless you have other comments. Yeah, these are tough things, and it was real 2,000 years ago, and it's real today, absolutely today in every church. I talked to the other clergy in the community, and everybody is struggling with these things. It's been a battle for the church from the beginning. We certainly haven't figured out the answer, but nevertheless, that's the standard. That's the goal we need to reach to. Well, thanks for coming together, folks.
Yeah, thank you.
This beautiful day. Enjoy the afternoon. Get out a little bit.
Yeah, you guys both too.
Okay. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye, Terry.
That's okay.